Davis.
And I'm John P. You know, we've been talking a lot about mobile stuff, but we've been beating around the bush because we have yet to address the issue of actual physical hardware.
So let's answer the question today on Talk Mobile. Do specs matter? Phil.
Yes and no. To some people they do, to some people they don't. To a lot of our readers, I think, who, speeds and feeds folks, yes. To my mom, she doesn't care.
It's almost like specs only matter in providing you with that experience. And differently, Apple doesn't even mention specs. You can't find the megahertz most of the time, no idea what RAM it is until someone tears it apart. But they'll be really specific about the camera because they feel like that is something that an average person can relate to.
I was going to say specs actually can be divided into two ways, macro and micro. So the micro would just be on individual devices. Does that matter? Probably not. I would say, as new devices come out, it's less important. At macro, though, as technology improves overall, it does matter because things like, I think it was ARM's new big small chipsets where they have micro and small processors alternating. This is like really big technology.
And there's so many misunderstandings, especially in my world on the Android side of things. It's, well, I only have, 200 megabytes of RAM left, and RAM's being wasted. No, it's not being wasted. If you're not using it, you're wasting it. And there's a big discrepancy, I think, in the understanding of it. Can any of you tell me what difference in real-world experience you're going to see from a 200 megahertz increase in a processor clock? You're not going to see it.
Well, that's the thing with quad core, dual core. It's not the amount of cores, it's what you do with them. Some operating systems, because they're decoupled, it's not one manufacturer making them, they need as much power as they can get to get the performance out. But you have BlackBerry, you have iOS, and you can build the software exactly for that hardware, and then the second core can do AirPlay, the second core can run the animation layers for the interface, and then you start to get a really good experience out of that.
And how about areas where people really do see the impact? For example, let's talk about storage. I routinely fill up a 16 gig device, and certain phones or tablets that only have maybe half or 1 gig of RAM can run out. What about that?
That's less about evolution of hardware than it is hardware choices. It's not that you're doing anything differently with a 32 gigabyte device versus a 64. That's just capacity. That's an easy decision.
Points.
Right. Those are talking points.
But price points matter in the real world, don't they?
They matter less to you and I think, than they do to the people actually buying the phones, and that's the U.S. carriers.
Android created a bit of a specs race for a couple of years too, because when you start making specs matter to consumers, then they matter to the hardware manufacturers, and especially in Android where they're putting out, it's not just Android versus BlackBerry versus iOS versus Windows Phone. It's Android versus Android versus Android versus Android versus Android. So they get into their own specs race, and they make consumers want to focus on specs, whereas Apple's releasing a phone a year, not even talking about them.
I'd almost say we're reaching the end of that even with Android.
It's
plateauing. Yeah, all this technology is cyclical. We saw it with digital photography and the megapixel race. That's over now. We saw it in home PCs with Gigahertz and how fast that was going. Then it backed off from that. So I think with phones too, they're actually now starting to step back. Android has improved a lot recently because they focus on the OS, making that more efficient instead of relying on the hardware.
All right, so if you were to be able to talk to the manufacturers and give them advice, which all of you do,
Which you can.
What would you say? Be more conservative or be more aggressive with their specs?
I think it's actually a little bit of both. I mean, one thing I like about Nokia is they're sort of doing this range. They're taking devices and making them real low end with minimal specs, but not compromising on the experience, but then also going all the way up to the high end. And I think when you give consumers the choice, that's ultimately who wins.
For me, it's all about passion. Like, you can tell which CEO, like from which company from the CEO on down cares about that phone. That if that phone is not working, they're down there raising hell. And they have a singular vision for that phone. So maybe the camera is the important thing. But when a phone is just a hodgepodge of specs to fill out a checklist, then I think it's nothing to anybody, and it just doesn't end up being a good experience.
I think choice is powerful, and I think some companies give arguably too much choice, where it gets really hard for the consumers to even decide what they want to buy. At the other end, you have maybe not enough choice, where we don't have a phablet-sized iPhone yet. But maybe
Apple hasn't invented it
That's
yet.
banned.
So we're banned. Sorry, I was not paying attention. But I think a good amount of choice. I mean, if you look at, say, the two phones in your hands right now, essentially the same hardware and specs. BlackBerry knows there's still demand for physical keyboards, so they're going to offer that to consumers. They're going to do the full touchscreen. And you'll probably see them do different price points also, as Dan's mentioning later on.
So I think what I'm hearing is that hardware really only matters until we start talking about software.
Thank you so much for joining us each and every day. We really appreciate it, and we absolutely want your feedback. But come back tomorrow for more.
That's right. I'm John P.
I'm Callie Lewis. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.